G'day, I'm Patrick from Douglas Fir Design. Welcome to the Router Bits. Recently got asked by a local restaurant to make some dough boards or pasta boards. These are, I'm told, really common, especially amongst the Italian community when they're making big things of pizza dough and handmade pasta, so that you have a working space that's bordered by timber so your stuff isn't spilling out onto the bench and you can carry it around, move it wherever you need to move it. I thought it was a great opportunity to use one of my favorite really simple router joints, which is a sliding dovetail join, and it makes this whole project really, really simple. So I've made these just out of pine. I wanted them to be as simple and utilitarian as possible, but if you were making this as a gift, you could choose some lovely hardwoods, you could make something really, really fancy. It wasn't what I needed to do for this project, but all the techniques we'll be using will obviously be exactly the same. So we have sliding dovetail join for the rails onto the board. I'll show you how to do that. And we then rounded over all of these top pieces, and I've also put a nice little handle underneath, which I've done with a dish cutting bit. I'll show you those three techniques and explain why I've chosen them, and then you'll be able to make one. Obviously, you can make any size you like. This is a nice big one because for a commercial application, that's what they're after. But you could make a little TV tray or a little tray for eating breakfast in bed in exactly the same way. So, in the process of building this, there's a really important thing to think about, which is actually the way that timber expands and contracts. And this is something that you might come up against if you're building a chopping board with what's called a breadboard end, where you have all the timber grain running in this direction and then a piece running horizontally over the end, or even a table where you're capping the ends with a piece of timber that runs with the grain in the opposite direction to the rest of the table. Now, the reason that this is so important is you can imagine that the timber, with all of its grain running long ways this way, you can imagine it like a group of straws or capillaries all bunched together. And as they absorb moisture from the air, all of those straws expand ever so slightly. Over the width of a whole board like this, the difference between a really dry day and a really humid day might be up to like a 5 mil difference in the width of this piece of timber. Now, if you see these bits of timber on the end, where the grain is going the other direction, timber doesn't really expand very much in this direction. So even though these bits will be growing, shrinking and contracting, expanding and contracting, these pieces of timber will not move. And what that results in is that expansion can be so strong that it will destroy a glue joint, or it'll split this timber if those are joined together permanently. So what you need to do, and this goes for a breadboard, like I said, or a chopping board or something like this, is you need to make sure that if you have joined timber in this way, that they're actually only locked together in one place, which allows for that expansion and contraction to happen naturally. So normally with a chopping board, you would join them in the center, and then that expansion would be split evenly on either side. But because I've got a miter joint in the back here, I've actually joined this rail in the back corner, which will allow all of the expansion and contraction to happen forward. These rails towards the front aren't glued on at all. And that's one of the beautiful things about this dovetail join, is it slides, but it's also locked that tray into the rail so it can't escape, and it's nice and firm, but it still allows for that expansion and contraction. So, really important thing to think about. Often the difference between novice woodworking and experienced woodworkers is thinking about things like that, which means you get a product which will last a very long time. So, the dovetail join requires two sides, a male and a female. I think that's the best way to describe it. The first cut we're going to do is the female component, which is going to be cut into the rail itself. So I have one of the previous pieces from one of the ones I've already made, and I'm going to use that to set the height of the dovetail bit, which will remain the same through both processes, cutting the tray as well as the rail, and then I'll also use this piece to set the fence. So you might wonder how I set the depth the first time, because I'm using an existing piece to set the depth and the height of the bit and the depth of the fence. Now, the way I've decided on this is I've actually put this dovetail halfway into this timber in terms of the height. So the timber's 19 mil, so the depth is about 9.5. Honestly, it's fairly arbitrary. If you put it too deep, you're gonna weaken the timber. But if you put it too shallow, you're gonna weaken the joint. So I just decided on somewhere about in the middle. And that gives me a good balance between the strength of this rail and also the strength of the joint. In terms of how far into this piece of timber from the edge, that was just how far I wanted the tray to sit up inside the rail. So I've left a good 10 mil from the deepest part of the cut to the edge, which will leave me a nice strong strip along the bottom, because if this is too small, it might fall off. And also a nice high rail on the actual board itself, which is the whole purpose of this exercise. I'm going to do this in one pass. It's only pine. It's cutting about 9 mil in. If you're using really hard timber and you wanted to do it in 2 passes, the only way to do it is actually use a smaller dovetail bit. There's no way with the dovetail bit to do the first pass lower or anything like that to make it easier on the machine. But by using a smaller dovetail bit, you can take out some of the material first, and then the larger dovetail bit will take out what's left of that hole. But like I said, I'm just doing a single pass. It's in pine. It'll be okay. So I've cut my 3 rails. I'd already pre-cut these to length, a little bit over length, and I'd already put a miter on one end, and I'll basically just be trimming that square end later to length. So these are done. Now we're ready to cut the male component on the tray itself. The way we do that, we actually leave the dovetail bit at the height that it is, exactly the same, and we're going to move the fence. Now, because this tray is quite tall, and I'm going to have to run it over the router table in this direction, I'm going to put on my supplementary high fence that I've built. Now, you can do this without that, but this makes it a lot easier. There's a little bit more detail on this supplementary fence in our panel raising bit video. I think it's the vertical panel raising bit video, but basically this just slides into the T-track on my router fence and gives me a firm vertical surface for me to run things along, workpieces, so that they don't fall out of square. So I'll just put this on, and then we're going to set the depth of the fence so that we can do our dovetail cuts on both sides of the board. I'll show you how to do that. So now that I have my vertical fence on here, I can set the distance from the fence to the router bit. The way that you cut the male component of a dovetail like this is actually in 2 passes. We set the dovetail bit so we go 1 pass on this side, we flip the board around and do a 2nd pass, and that's how you get that dovetail feature. In order to set the depth, what we're trying to do is get the bottom corner of the timber to be the only bit that hasn't been cut. So that means that this, at the point where the dovetail bit intersects the line made by the bed of the router table and the vertical router fence, there should be no blade there. Sometimes it's best to do a test cut. Obviously the test cut needs to be of the same thickness material as what you're going to be using, and that way you can see if it's going to be too loose or too tight. And that's what's going to happen if you've got the fence set too far back or too far forward, is the joint either just won't go in at all, or it'll just be too loose and too sloppy. So I've set the depth of the fence and locked it off. I will do a really quick test cut. Again, what I'm looking for is this bottom edge where I'm drawing my pencil line to not actually be cut by the router bit. When I'm doing my large panels, I will be using feather boards, but let me just run this through really quick. Yep, that looks perfect. You can see that that pencil line is retained. I might actually bring the fence towards me a little bit more, just so I can retain a little bit more of that pencil line. This is just because I actually found that this board, even though it's meant to be 19mm, is about 18mm.3, and so it was a little bit loose in the previous channels that I'd cut, so I want to make a slightly wider dovetail, and so the way to do that is to just make sure that the bit isn't cutting quite as deep into this timber. But other than that, I'm going to set my feather board so it's all sitting firmly against the fence, and I'm going to run around 3 sides on my tray. I have to do both sides of each cut to get that dovetail shape. So I cut the male dovetail component into the tray. The first pass that I did, the dovetail was actually too big, so I moved the fence back a little bit to expose a little bit more blade, ran it through again, and now it fits perfectly. As you can see, it's firm, but I can still move it, which is exactly what I want. Now, I'm just going to line up this edge with where the miter needs to interact with that corner, and that lets me see how much I need to trim off on this end. So I'm just going to mark both of these rails, trim that excess off just on the drop saw, and then we'll be ready to measure and mark where we want the handholds, the little recesses that we're going to cut out with the dish cutting bit. The next thing we're going to do is be cutting out these little recesses on the bottom for your handholds. I'm cutting them out with a dish cutting bit, and I'm using a sled that will slide on the router table. I've just made it myself. Got to put the 2 rail pieces on this sled, slide it back and forth in the miter track, and that allows us to get nice straight recesses. With this bit, we're going to have to do a few passes to cover that full 100mm that I want for my handhold. I've marked that out just with a pencil, obviously, but my rails are 600mm long. I wanted 100mm of handhold, so that leaves 250mm on each side. So I've just measured and marked them out on both sides. It just makes it a little bit easier. Clamp them together. Now I've set my dish cutting bit in the router, and now I have to set the height, and the height needs to be high enough to cut into the timber, obviously, but not high enough to cut through into our actual dovetail slots there. So I'm going to measure the depth of those dovetail slots and make sure that the router sits lower than that once I've placed this sled on the table. Now that we have all of our dovetails cut and our little handles cut, the only thing left to do is to glue it all up, and then once it's dry, I'll go around with a round over bit and just smooth it all off so it looks more like this finished one here. One thing to keep in mind when you're gluing this up is that the whole idea of this is that we allow that expansion to happen naturally as it wants to. So on these side rails, you only want to put a bit of glue towards the back, no further forward than, let's say, 100mm. Let all of that expansion happen out here naturally. The back rail can be glued in permanently. This will expand and contract at the same very small rate that the rest of the board will, because the grain's running in the same direction. So that can be glued on, the miters can be glued in. Just make sure that these rails are only glued just towards the back here. Once that's all dry, then you can just run around the whole thing with your round over bit. So you can get it all looking like this. Make sure you round over the bottom edge and these hand holds so that they feel nice and smooth. And then give everything a rough sand and it's ready to go. There's a couple of different ways you can finish this. I've recommended the client use grapeseed oil, which is commonly used on chopping boards. It's a great finish because it's obviously 100% natural. It is used as a food oil, so you can just buy it from the supermarket. And as it soaks in, if you need to apply some more, you can just put some more on. It doesn't fully dry like something like a Danish oil will, so it is a natural oil finish. You would buff off any excess, but it's a great way to treat products that are going to be used consistently with food because it's so easy to reapply. Another great option is the Gilly Stevenson range of food-safe oils for wood products. You can grab them at Timbecon. There's some oils and waxes. I think they're orange oil based, and that would be perfect for this as well. Make sure there's no dust on it, and you're ready to go make some pasta.